What if I told you that free markets don't actually exist? Well, not in the way that you think it does. Imagine this, a market with no interference, no manipulation, and no hidden hands pulling the strings. It's pure economic freedom, right? But here's the problem. It never works. Not for long, at least. You see, markets are like dominoes. When one piece that's big enough ends up falling, it doesn't stop there. The rest will inevitably follow. Businesses collapse, people lose jobs, demand dries up, and the entire system spirals downward, unless something steps in to stop it. You see, in times of crisis, capitalism simply cannot survive without one thing, and that's government intervention. And this has been proven time and time again. And the man who figured this out? Well, it's the same guy who predicted the Second World War 2 decades before it actually happened. John Maynard Keynes was an eccentric stock market gambler, a socialite, and an economist. And without him, the story of money and modern economics would look very, very different. To understand the true impact of Keynes, you need to see how things were before his time. Because back then, economic principles were very different. Recessions were seen as storms that you just had to endure. And governments tightened their belts and they just let businesses fail and waited for things to fix themselves. But Keynes tore that idea apart. His big message was simple. When times are tough, the government just has to step in. They should spend money to keep demand alive. And that thinking shaped modern economics. But how did he get there? His personal experiences, his failures with old economic models, and a desperate need for solutions in a collapsing world forced him to challenge everything economists believed. In fact, some of the ways that governments respond to recessions that happen today follow a lot of Keynes's principles. And there are plenty of these kinds of instances that we've seen play out in real life. I mean, think about the recent pandemic. The government sent out stimulus checks to help stabilize the economy to prevent it from shrinking. I mean, this echoes Keynes's idea that public spending can keep the economy moving during a crisis. But government spending wasn't the only idea that Keynes came up with. He believed that central banks must actively manage the economy too. We all know about the Federal Reserve and how it often raises interest rates to control inflation. This way, they restrict the money supply and keep prices from spiraling out of control. So, Keynes's idea were not only limited to managing crisis, but also about building the foundation for future growth. And that's where big investments in infrastructure comes in. Take the example when former President Biden announced the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It was a Keynesian move to get people back to work and put money back into the economy. When you invest in things like roads, bridges, and broadband, you're creating jobs and boosting long-term growth. Well, that's a theory at least. But these are long-term fixes. What about people who are struggling to eat today? That's where welfare programs come in. He believed that safety nets were key to keeping markets thriving. And without them, we would risk deeper poverty and worse economic instability. For instance, unemployment benefits or social security. These programs keep people afloat when the economy takes a hit. They also ensure that money keeps flowing into the economy, which is exactly what Keynes thought we needed during rough patches. Look, this barely scratches the surface of Keynes's views of the economy and his impact. Because most economists back in his time believed that the free market would eventually sort things out if they were just given enough time, the laissez-faire approach. But Keynes saw the crisis differently. He didn't think that the economy would just fix itself magically. In fact, he was convinced that it didn't. He saw firsthand what happened during the Great Depression. People were out of work, businesses were failing, and things didn't really look like they would get better magically by itself. He believed that the government couldn't afford to wait for the market to just recover on its own. Instead, he argued for immediate action and a groundbreaking idea called government intervention. Public works programs, infrastructure projects, anything to get people to work again, even if it meant running on a budget deficit. This became known as the Keynesian economic model. But this idea was met with heavy resistance, as you can imagine. Many economists thought that the government intervention was unnecessary and dangerous. At the time, the British Treasury was convinced that pouring money into public works would be pointless and it would cause a decline in private investment. Now, fast forward to 1936, that's when Keynes published the great theory of employment, interest, and money. And in this book, he laid out his economic theory in great detail and essentially flipped the script. He argued that government jobs programs have solid economic reasoning behind them, and they were the real solution to unemployment. This was the foundation of what we now call Keynesian economics. If demand is low, the government can help by increasing public spending and investing in infrastructure or jobs programs to boost demand. And that's exactly what the economy needed. More demand, more spending, and more jobs. Keynes argued that the driving force of any economy is demand. When people spend money, it creates a ripple effect. Businesses start producing more, people get hired, and confidence in the economy grows. But the reverse is also true. When people stop spending, like in a recession, demand falls and that vicious cycle just keeps going. You see, according to Keynes, the economy stood on 4 key pillars. These were consumption, so what people spend, investment, so what businesses put into growth, government purchases, things like spending on public services and infrastructure, and the last one is net exports. That's the difference between what a country sells and buys from other nations. So in good times, all of these 4 pillars drive economic growth. People spend, businesses invest, governments build, and trade keeps moving. But you see, during a recession, demand collapses and consumption shrinks, and this leads businesses to stop investing and trade slows down as a result. This emphasizes just how important demand is to the equation. Because if demand falls, the government just has to step in to boost it back to optimal levels. Now, it wasn't inevitable that Keynes' journey would have such a big impact on economics and the world. I mean, it could have gone very differently. He had the intellect and the connections to succeed in various other fields. I mean, his upbringing, his education, and his personal curiosity led him to reshape economic thought instead. He grew up in a fairly prosperous family full of thinkers. His father was an economist at Cambridge, and his mother was one of the first women to graduate from there. Naturally, Keynes followed in their footsteps and joined Cambridge in 1902. And no doubt, Cambridge was a melting pot of creativity and ideas. He became part of a vibrant community of writers and artists. You could say that it was here that his views on economics began to take shape. To begin with, he was drawn to mathematics. But then the critical moment came when the renowned economist Alfred Marshall persuaded him to shift his academic interests towards politics and economics. That one shift changed everything for him. Keynes stood out as a top student of Marshall and A.C. Pijou, who were experts on competitive markets. But while he learned from them, he didn't always agree. He started questioning whether free markets could actually fix themselves. After graduating, Keynes started out as a lecturer at King's College, Cambridge, where he began to shake up orthodox thought. He was already turning heads with his ideas, but you see, teaching wasn't enough for him. He wanted real-world experiences. So he took roles in the British Civil Service and the Treasury. In 1919, he was sent to the Versailles Peace Conference. This was where leaders were deciding how to rebuild after World War I. Now, Keynes' role at the Versailles Peace Conference could have set him on a clear path to a public career. He was right there, advising Prime Minister David Lloyd George on critical economic decisions. But what he saw in France left him disillusioned. All the political maneuvering and the harsh penalties that were imposed on Germany just didn't sit right with him. For him, he had a bad feeling. He thought that this bad policy would actually cause a disaster that was waiting to happen. But modern analysis of this shows that he was wrong, probably, because the Germans offered to pay a very similar amount to the agreement. However, it did leave Germany in a very weak position, which was the intention of this agreement to begin with. But see, Keynes was right in a way, because he thought that this would lead to a darker outcome. In a way, he was predicting some of the aspects of the Second World War that would happen 2 decades later. The idea of Europe facing even more destruction troubled him deeply. He wrote to his father, calling it the devastation of Europe. Unable to endorse the big decisions being made, he resigned and published his opinions in The Economic Consequences of Peace. This point led him to rethink how economies should be managed in times of crisis. But this alone wasn't enough to move him away from free market thinking. If Versailles planted the seed of doubt in Keynes' mind, it was the 1929 Wall Street crash that was the event that cemented it. Keynes was not the same after the 1929 crash. The Great Depression hit hard. It didn't only crush Wall Street, it took down the whole world economy. For Keynes, this was a wake-up call. It was proof that the free market was not the solution people thought it was. He believed that the system needed a complete overhaul, not only to make it work, but to prove that it could outshine alternatives like communism. So basically, Keynes's work couldn't have come at a more crucial time. You see, the Great Depression was a time of unimaginable hardship, as I mentioned earlier. Jobs were disappearing by the millions, and families were suffering. Even something as basic as marriage rates dropped significantly as people struggled to survive. The world as they knew it was falling apart. The Great Depression was not just a single event. It was a series of financial crises that were started by the stock market crash. Then came the regional bank panics of 1930 and 31. It was like a snowball effect, one crisis after another. People lost faith. By 1933, the US commercial banking system collapsed completely. But amid all of this, something crucial was missing: answers. I mean, existing economic theories failed to explain this collapse, and they sure didn't offer any solutions to fix it. Amidst all this certainty, Keynes introduced a new radical way of thinking. Literally, his ideas influenced real policy changes. Meanwhile, President Franklin Roosevelt had no choice but to act. The New Deal was his response to address the crisis in the United States. It was a bold and all-out effort to revive the nation. Whether people knew it or not, Keynes's ideas were a big part of it. Roosevelt's programs were literally reshaping the system. New agencies were created to provide jobs. Unemployment was fought back with government-funded projects. And the price of everyday goods were stabilized. And this was actually aimed at securing the future. You see, Roosevelt took Keynes's ideas even further. He expanded government spending to pump life back into the economy. Under the New Deal, the government launched massive public works projects. Public housing sprang up, slums were cleared, and railroads were built. So the New Deal put Keynes's ideas into action. However, the end of World War II brought new challenges and opportunities, and Keynes's influence didn't fade. In fact, it became even more significant as nations rebuilt their economies. But this was not before Keynes himself suffered a major health scare. In 1937, he suffered a severe heart attack. But this wasn't enough to stop him, though. He went on to publish The General Theory, his final major written work. He continued to play a key role in the emerging economic system. In the summer of 1944, a small town of Bretton Woods in New Hampshire became the center stage for a meeting like no other. Delegates from 44 nations gathered, but not for idle debate, but to construct an entirely new financial framework. The world was at a crossroads. Either they built a stable financial order or risk repeating the mistakes of the past. You see, the delegates were not looking to replicate the failures of their previous international monetary systems. They wanted something more flexible, something that could encourage cooperation rather than competition only. The world had seen how rigid systems could break under pressure, and they couldn't afford yet another global collapse. So, at the core of this historic effort were two visionaries. The first, of course, was John Maynard Keynes, serving as the advisor to the British Treasury. And the other significant person here is Harry Dexter White, the chief international economist for the US Treasury Department. Now, while their approaches often clashed, their shared goal was pretty clear: to design a system that would stabilize economies and lay the groundwork for prosperity in a world still recovering from war. At that time, John Maynard Keynes was already a towering figure in economics. He brought his bold vision to Bretton Woods. He believed that global stability required a powerful institution capable of stepping in during crises. True to his principles, Keynes advocated for public institutions to actively manage economic imbalances instead of just passively observing them. No doubt, his plan was revolutionary. Keynes proposed the creation of a global central bank, a clearing union. This would issue a new international currency, the bankor. And this currency would serve as the neutral medium. It would allow nations to settle trade imbalances without draining their reserves or triggering economic turmoil. Now, in contrast to Keynes's ambitious visions, Harry Dexter White brought a more cautious and calculated approach to the table. His plan reflected America's dominant economic position and concerns about equity. White was not sold on Keynes's grand idea of a global central bank or the new bankor currency. You see, he believed that the bankor could disproportionately benefit nations like Britain and funnel financial resources towards purchasing American goods. As a result, it would leave the US with an outsized share of the bankor. So instead, White envisioned a stabilization fund, a simpler and cleaner alternative. This monetary institution would rely on a fixed pool of $5 million in national currencies and gold, rather than introducing a new global currency. So at the end, the plan that was adopted at the Bretton Woods looked more like White's vision. But there was a few nods to Keynes's concerns. You see, the US had the upper hand, but they couldn't ignore the risks that Keynes pointed out. So a compromise was struck. For example, one prominent addition was a safeguard against currency shortages. If a country built up too much of a trade surplus and its currency became scarce, the fund had the power to step in. It could ration that currency and even allow limited imports from the surplus nation to keep things balanced. Another tweak was about money in the pot. The original $5 million fund was raised to $8.5 million, and that gave the system a little more breathing room. So this plan was actually a step towards a more cooperative world economy. Now, Keynes's ideas also guided the creation of two historic institutions. The International Monetary Fund would act as a safety net to help countries avoid economic freefalls. Meanwhile, the World Bank Group would drive development and recovery and rebuild nations from the ground up. John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White may have had different visions, but together they shaped the foundation of the modern financial system. For years after World War II, Keynes's ideas dominated economic policy. Governments followed his approach of active intervention to stabilize markets and reduce unemployment, and it worked well for a while. The IMF focused on financial stability and ensured countries can get through economic storms, and the World Bank takes a long view. It works to reduce poverty and drive sustainable growth. Their methods are different, but their purpose are the same: creating a more stable and prosperous world, just as Keynes had envisioned. But Keynesian economics wasn't invincible. In the 1970s, something happened that it couldn't explain: stagflation. Stagflation was basically when inflation soared while the economy stopped growing. Now, that's not how it was supposed to work. Keynesian economic theory focused on managing demand, but this crisis was different. It needed a new solution. As prices rose and jobs disappeared, faith in Keynes's ideas began to fade. Policymakers turned to alternative theories and started looking for ways to fight inflation without hurting economic growth. The era of unquestioned Keynesian dominance was over. However, I believe that blame was unjustified. The 1970s crisis didn't expose a flaw in Keynes's original ideas, but in how they were interpreted. You see, the economists had relied too much on the Phillips curve, which suggested that inflation and unemployment had a simple trade-off. But Keynes never wrote about that. His work never claimed that inflation would stay predictable. Yet, when stagflation hit, Keynesian economics was the one that took the fall. Then, the new classical school of economic theory took center stage. It argued that government policies were mostly useless because markets could predict and counteract them. If a government tried to boost demand, businesses and workers would just adjust their expectations. Ultimately, it would cancel out any effect, and intervention was not the solution, and that it was the problem. And soon, these ideas shaped real-world policies. With the elections of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US, the IMF and the World Bank changed course. Free markets took priority. Government intervention was seen as the enemy. Their mission had changed. Loans now came with strings attached. They were called structural adjustments. Countries in crisis had to slash public spending, deregulate industries, and privatize state assets. You see, Keynes had pushed for government action to stabilize economies, but now his own institutions were enforcing the opposite. Ironically, Keynes's own creations and the institutions that he helped to design became instruments for the movement that rejected him. The world turned away from Keynesianism. But would it really stay that way? You see, Keynesianism was not gone for good until the world was faced with yet another financial disaster, and his theories made a comeback. In the wake of the 2007-2009 economic recession, his ideas saw a huge revival. When the global economy was on the brink of collapse, former President Barack Obama turned to Keynesian principles for guidance. The federal government bailed out several struggling industries to prevent a complete economic meltdown. In 2009, Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act into law. It was a massive $831 billion stimulus package for saving jobs and reinvesting in the future. Tax cuts, unemployment benefits, and funding for healthcare, infrastructure, and education. You see, it was a modern-day application of Keynes's vision: government action to stabilize and rebuild. But that wasn't the last we've seen of Keynes's ideas. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 brought a new wave of economic disruption, and once again, Keynesian economics proved relevant. Under Presidents Trump and Biden, the US government stepped in with massive relief efforts. Emergency programs were rolled out, offering loan forgiveness, loan extensions, and relief to businesses and individuals alike. State unemployment benefits were supplemented, and American taxpayers received a direct aid in the form of 3 separate stimulus checks tax-free. These actions mirrored the ideas Keynes had proposed. It was a modern response to a global crisis that is driven by the belief that the state must play a crucial role in stabilizing the economy. Even though Keynes passed away more than 50 years ago, his insights into recessions continue to influence how we approach economic crises today. His ideas remain a key part of how we try to fix the economy when it falls apart. Despite the widespread impact of Keynes's theories, the narrative of how an economy should run has been far from one-sided. This was even during the height of Keynesian influence. On the opposing side was the Chicago School of Economics, led by free market heavyweights, and they saw things very differently. They argued that recessions and booms were only a natural flow of the economy. There was no need to meddle. In fact, they believed that government intervention only made the recovery take longer. The market would eventually sort itself out if the government only stayed out of its way. Amongst the loudest critics was Milton Friedman. If Keynes was the face of intervention, Friedman was the voice of restraint. A believer in monetarism, Friedman thought that controlling the money supply rather than throwing cash into the system was more important in stabilizing the economy. Keynes's reliance on constant intervention didn't sit well with him. During the second half of the 20th century, Friedman's ideas gained traction as a counterpoint to Keynes's. His rise was a sign of the times. Markets started to question whether the Keynesian approach was sustainable in the long run. The debate between Keynesianism and monetarism was heated, and it shaped the economic situation for years to come. Monetarists had a very different view. They agreed that money could help boost the economy, for sure, but only in the short run. But they believed that over time, it would only lead to inflation. In other words, they argued that if government kept pumping money into the economy, the prices would rise, but the real growth would never follow. They stressed that to keep things stable, the government needed to focus on controlling the money supply. Some critics went even as far as accusing Keynes of promoting socialism. It's true that Keynes showed interest in how socialist regimes functioned and argued for a stronger role in government economic matters. However, he believed that government intervention was necessary to smooth out the rough patches of business cycles. He didn't think that private businesses should operate without any oversight. On the other hand, Keynes was not advocating for a complete government control over industries. He didn't believe that the state should run businesses or take over production. Instead, he thought that the government should only step in to guide and support the economy, but only when things went wrong. This would stimulate demand when it slowed down and make sure that growth was steady. He envisioned a role for central authorities in managing the economy's ups and downs, but not in taking full control of how things were produced or how businesses operated. It was about achieving balance, not about suppressing the free market as his critics claimed. But regardless of which camp you're in, no one can doubt that Keynes's ideas have shaped economic theories today. Governments regularly implement deficit spending during recessions, central banks adjust interest rates to manage inflation and unemployment, and public works programs are staples of economic recovery. It all goes back to Keynes. So his legacy is everywhere, even now. Whether you agree with his ideas or not, they are impossible to ignore. But what do you think? Should his ideas be embraced more fully, or are there better ways to handle economic downturns? Please leave a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear them out. Also, if you've made it this far into the video, leave a $sign in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And check out this video that I made about JP Morgan's life and his influence on finance. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.